Hollywood has always loved stories about redemption, about broken people who are saved just in time, about families who survive everything and come out stronger in the end. From the outside, the Reiner family seemed to fit that narrative perfectly. A legendary director, a respected producer, a home in Brentwood, a life that looked stable, protected, and quietly successful. But behind closed doors, something had been slipping for years. This is not a story that begins with violence. It begins with exhaustion, with silence, with parents who kept believing that love, patience, and one more chance could still change the ending. It begins with a family that tried to save their son again and again, long after the warning signs stopped being subtle. Hollywood rarely talks about what happens when rescue fails. In December 2025, that silence finally broke. Not because anyone was ready to speak, but because there was no longer a way to look away. 2 lives ended inside a bedroom that was supposed to be safe. A son disappeared into the city. And a family that had spent decades fighting quietly was forced into the harshest spotlight imaginable. This is not a story about shock. It is a story about inevitability. About moments when things could have stopped but didn't. And about the cost of loving someone for too long in a place where everything is supposed to have a happy ending. Tracy Reiner remembers the guest house behind her parents' home as a place that was meant to offer distance without abandonment. It was where boundaries were supposed to exist, quietly, without confrontation. In early December 2025, Nick Reiner was staying there again temporarily after another period of instability. When he asked Tracy to come talk to him privately, she agreed, believing it would be another difficult but manageable conversation. It was evening when they met. The room was small. The air felt heavy. Nick did not start with apologies or explanations. He went straight to what he wanted. He needed money, and not a small amount. He did not name a figure, only insisted that he needed it immediately, that without it everything would collapse. Tracy listened, trying to stay calm, trying to understand what kind of trouble he was in this time. As Nick spoke, his body never settled. He sat down, stood up, paced, stopped, then paced again. His hands clenched and released without him noticing. He talked about debts that had been growing for years, about people who had stopped answering his calls, about the belief that his family no longer trusted him. His voice was not loud, but it carried a pressure that filled the room. Then the focus shifted. Nick began talking about their parents, not with anger, but with something colder. He spoke as if they had delayed decisions that should have been made long ago. He said he had waited long enough, that his patience was gone. Tracy noticed that his eyes never stayed in one place, that he kept glancing toward the door, the window, anywhere but her face. The moment that unsettled her most came without warning. Nick stepped closer. His voice dropped. The space between them narrowed. Tracy later said she could not explain why, only that something inside her reacted immediately. Her body told her to leave. When her phone rang, she took it without hesitation. She stood, said she had to go, and walked out without looking back. Her hands shook as she reached her car. The fear did not fade when she got home. It stayed with her for days. She considered telling her parents everything, but with tensions already high and the holidays approaching, she hesitated, telling herself she might be overreacting. At the time, nothing illegal had happened. There were no threats that could be quoted, no actions that could be reported, no clear line that had been crossed. What remained was intuition, the kind that cannot be filed away as evidence. Tracy tried to return to normal routines, but the conversation replayed itself in fragments. His tone, his distance, the way the room had felt smaller by the second. Later, she would say that this was the moment she now recognizes as a warning. Not a prediction, but a signal. One that arrived quietly and left just as quietly, without asking permission to be believed. It lingered long after the conversation officially ended there. Nick Reiner grew up inside a version of Hollywood that most people only see from the outside. Comfort was never an issue. Doors opened easily. Help was always nearby. But from an early age, those closest to him noticed something restless beneath the surface. He struggled with limits, reacted intensely to frustration, and carried a constant internal agitation that never fully quieted. As a teenager, Nick gravitated toward risk. He stayed out late, resisted structure, and searched for ways to escape the noise in his own head. According to later interviews, he would describe his mind as crowded and relentless, a place where thoughts never slowed down. What began as experimentation quickly turned into dependency, followed by the first of many attempts at treatment. Over the years, Nick cycled in and out of rehabilitation centers across California. Some stays lasted months, others ended abruptly. Each return home carried hope, followed by disappointment. His family welcomed him back every time, believing that stability might finally take hold. Instead, the same patterns resurfaced, often more intense than before. With time, addiction was joined by another force: gambling. At first, it appeared harmless, framed as entertainment rather than escape. But losses mounted quickly. According to family accounts and media sources, Nick began borrowing money repeatedly, promising that the next win would erase everything. Each loss deepened the pressure. Each request increased the tension. Nick's relationship with money became emotional rather than practical. Debt was no longer just financial, it was psychological. When confronted, he often reacted defensively, insisting that no one understood him. He spoke about being trapped, about needing just one opportunity to reset his life. That opportunity never came. In 2015, Nick worked with his father on the film Being Charlie. Publicly, he described the project as part of his recovery. Privately, the film echoed something far more personal. The main character's desire to silence the noise in his head mirrored words Nick had used for years. For a brief moment, it appeared that creativity might provide grounding. The stability did not last. As time passed, resentment quietly grew. Nick lived in the shadow of a father whose career defined an era of American film and a family legacy that felt impossible to escape. According to Tracy Reiner, Nick often believed he was scrutinized more harshly than others, especially when money was involved. That belief hardened into suspicion. Family relationships strained under the weight. Siblings kept their distance. Conversations became guarded. Support continued, but trust eroded. By the late 2010s, Nick's struggles were no longer private issues. They affected holidays, daily routines, and the emotional health of everyone involved. Looking back, Tracy would later say that Nick did not change suddenly. He repeated himself. The same patterns returned again and again, each time with higher stakes. Addiction, gambling, resentment, and dependence intertwined until they could no longer be separated. What remained was a man who felt cornered, misunderstood, and increasingly disconnected from reality. This was not a descent that happened overnight. It unfolded slowly, quietly, and mostly out of public view. And by the time December 2025 arrived, the cracks that had formed early were no longer hidden. They had simply been waiting for the moment when holding everything together would no longer be possible. For Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner, loving their son was never passive. It was active, exhausting, and constant. From the moment Nick's struggles became impossible to ignore, they chose involvement over distance, patience over abandonment. They did not treat his problems as phases that would resolve on their own. They treated them as emergencies that required action again and again. As early as Nick's teenage years, Rob and Michelle sought professional help. Psychologists, doctors, treatment programs, and support networks became part of the family's routine. Schedules were rearranged. Travel plans were canceled. Work commitments were adjusted around therapy sessions and rehabilitation stays. According to family accounts, there were periods when their lives revolved almost entirely around keeping Nick safe. When treatment ended, Nick was welcomed home without punishment or shame. Each return came with cautious optimism. The house was rearranged, expectations were lowered, space was created. When privacy became necessary, the guest house behind the main home offered a compromise. Close enough to monitor, distant enough to avoid constant friction. It was meant to protect everyone involved. There were nights when Rob and Michelle stayed awake until morning waiting for messages that never came. There were weeks when phone calls arrived late, urgent, and unresolved. According to Tracy Reiner, her parents measured success not in milestones but in survival. If Nick was alive that day, was considered a victory. The advice they received was often contradictory. Some professionals urged firmness, insisting that enabling behavior would only prolong the cycle. Others warned that cutting support could push Nick into deeper danger. Rob and Michelle tried both approaches at different times, never fully committing to either. They struggled with the same question that haunts many parents in similar situations: when does help become harm? Despite doubts and exhaustion, they never fully closed the door. Even when Nick refused treatment or cut contact for short periods, his parents stayed connected through friends and support networks. They monitored from a distance, hoping for signs of stability. They never stopped believing that recovery was still possible. Outside the home, Hollywood saw something else entirely. Rob Reiner remained a respected director. Michelle continued to appear composed and professional. Public life went on as expected. Private life did not. According to those close to the family, the contrast between public success and private struggle became heavier with each passing year. Family gatherings grew tense. Conversations became careful. The effort to maintain normalcy required constant emotional control. Siblings watched their parents age under the weight of worry. The strain was visible, even if rarely acknowledged aloud. Tracy later said that the household learned how to live inside uncertainty, treating crisis as a background condition rather than an interruption. Money complicated everything further. Financial support was often framed as temporary, conditional, and necessary. Boundaries were discussed, then redrawn. Each attempt to set limits risked triggering anger or withdrawal. Each attempt to soften those limits risked prolonging the cycle. There was no option that felt safe. In hindsight, Tracy would describe her parents' approach as one guided by love rather than strategy. They believed in staying, in waiting, in giving one more chance. What they could not see at the time was how much that love was costing them, or how thin the line had become between protection and exposure. This was not negligence. It was devotion pushed to its breaking point. And by the end of 2025, that breaking point was no longer theoretical. It was approaching quietly, shaped by years of effort, fear, and hope that refused to die even as everything else began to fray. On the night of the 13th of December 2025, Hollywood gathered the way it always does at the end of the year. Conan O'Brien's annual Christmas party was a familiar ritual filled with writers, performers, and longtime friends. The setting was warm, predictable, and carefully effortless. Music played softly beneath overlapping conversations. Laughter moved easily from room to room. Nick Reiner was there. According to multiple accounts later cited by media outlets, he did not blend into the rhythm of the evening. While guests circulated naturally, Nick lingered on the edges of the room, often standing alone for extended periods. When he did speak, his interactions felt strained. Several people recalled him repeatedly asking whether those he spoke to were famous, as if searching for something specific. His attention drifted quickly, rarely settling in one place. Those who later reflected on his behavior described it as unsettling rather than disruptive. Nick was not loud. He was not aggressive. He appeared detached, present physically, but disconnected from the social flow around him. His thoughts seemed to move faster than the moment allowed. Rob Reiner was also in attendance, surrounded by colleagues and friends who had known him for decades. From the outside, nothing appeared visibly wrong. But according to sources who later spoke to investigators and journalists, there was tension between father and son that evening. The details of their exchange were never fully made public. What was consistent across accounts was the shift in atmosphere that followed. Conversations briefly slowed, voices lowered. The ease of the evening fractured, then repaired itself the way social gatherings often do. Guests returned to their drinks. Laughter resumed. Whatever had occurred did not escalate into a scene. It dissolved into silence. Later, when Tracy Reiner learned about the party, one detail stayed with her more than any specific words. It was how out of place Nick seemed, how his behavior mirrored the restlessness she had witnessed days earlier in the guest house. The same sense of pressure beneath the surface, the same inability to settle. After the party ended, Rob and Michelle returned to their home in Brentwood. No urgent calls were made, no warnings were issued. To the outside world, the night ended like countless others before it, with quiet goodbyes and the assumption that there would be time to address whatever felt unresolved. Hollywood moved on. The party would later be revisited, not because it explained what followed, but because it failed to interrupt it. There were no clear threats, no dramatic confrontations demanding immediate action, only fragments that would gain meaning in hindsight. It was the last night where nothing had happened yet, and the last moment when everyone still believed there would be another chance. The following day began without alarms. The 14th of December 2025 unfolded quietly, without urgent calls or visible signs that anything had gone wrong. Hours passed. Messages went unanswered. For a family accustomed to long silences caused by distance travel or exhaustion, the absence did not immediately register as danger. It was Romy Reiner who felt the unease first. After repeated attempts to reach her parents failed, she decided to drive to their home in Brentwood. There was no panic, yet only concern. The house had always been a place of movement, conversation, and familiar routine. That expectation carried her through the front door. Inside, the silence was immediate. The home did not show signs of chaos. There were no broken windows, no overturned furniture, no evidence of a struggle spilling into shared spaces. Everything appeared still, almost preserved. As Romy moved through the house, the quiet grew heavier with each step. When she reached the bedroom, the illusion of normalcy ended. Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner were found inside, both suffering from multiple sharp force injuries. Emergency services were called. Law enforcement arrived. The scene was secured. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner would later classify the deaths as a homicide. There was no sign of Nick Reiner. As investigators began piecing together the timeline, it became clear that the violence had occurred sometime between the early morning hours and later that day. The exact sequence remained under investigation. What was immediately apparent was that the home, a place associated with decades of safety and stability, had become the site of irreversible loss. Outside news spread quickly. By the afternoon, media outlets began reporting on the deaths of the legendary director and his wife. Hollywood reacted with shock, disbelief, and confusion. Tributes appeared. Statements were issued. But inside, the family time collapsed inward. There was no space for public language. Only disbelief and fragments of memory that refused to stay still. As police continued their work, attention turned outward. Nick Reiner was unaccounted for. According to investigative information, later released surveillance footage placed him miles away from the Brentwood home later that day, moving through the city with visible agitation. His absence from the scene deepened concern and redirected the investigation. For Tracy Reiner, the details connected with brutal clarity. The conversation in the guest house, the pressure in his voice, the moment her instincts told her to leave. What had once felt abstract now rearranged itself into something concrete and unavoidable. That afternoon marked the end of one reality and the beginning of another. A family that had spent years fighting quietly was forced into the open. A home that had sheltered generations became a crime scene. And the question that would follow everyone involved was no longer hypothetical. It was already too late to stop what had begun. By the evening of the 14th of December 2025, the search had narrowed. Law enforcement identified Nick Reiner as a person of interest, not through speculation, but through absence, timing, and evidence still under review. Surveillance footage later released placed him at a gas station several miles from his parents' home earlier that day. His movements appeared restless, his attention drifted. He looked like someone trying unsuccessfully to stay grounded. Less than an hour later, officers located and detained him. The arrest did not bring relief. It brought confirmation. For the Reiner family, years of quiet fear collapsed into a single undeniable reality. The son they had spent decades trying to protect now stood at the center of the tragedy they could not stop. 3 days later, Nick Reiner appeared at the Los Angeles Central Courthouse for his first hearing. He did not enter a plea. He wore a suicide prevention vest. He spoke little. Courtroom sketches showed him withdrawn eyes, unfocused posture closed. The images spread quickly, detached from context and consumed by a public searching for answers that the legal process was not ready to provide. Prosecutors announced charges related to the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner, including aggravating factors involving multiple victims and the use of a dangerous object. An arraignment date was scheduled. Investigators continued their work. The case moved forward slowly as it was meant to, without commentary or resolution. For Tracy Reiner, the aftermath lived far from courtrooms. It existed in memory, in the realization that warning signs had been present long before the final day, even if none of them had offered a clear moment to intervene. She would later say that no family believes something like this will happen to them until it does. Public reaction followed familiar patterns. Tributes to Rob Reiner poured in across Hollywood, honoring his legacy, generosity, and influence. Michelle Reiner was remembered for her devotion to family and quiet strength. The industry mourned the figures it had known in public. Privately, the family released a joint statement. They asked for compassion, for restraint, for their parents to be remembered for the lives they lived, not the way they died. There were no explanations offered, only grief. Two realities now exist side by side. One unfolds through court hearings, evidence, and legal deadlines. The other exists inside a family left to carry love, loss, and an unbearable truth. Mental illness and addiction offer context, but they do not erase responsibility. This is not a story about closure. It is about consequence. Some tragedies arrive without warning. Others announce themselves quietly over years. This one did not come suddenly. It came slowly. And when it finally demanded attention, there was nothing left to negotiate. In the days that followed, Tracy Reiner struggled to find language for what had been taken from her. Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner were not only parents. They were the center of a family built on consistency, patience, and an unwavering belief in staying present even when doing so caused pain. Tracy has said she never felt different for being adopted. Love in her childhood was never conditional. Her siblings echoed the same sentiment. In a joint statement, they asked for privacy, for compassion, and for restraint. They did not ask the public to understand what could not be understood. They asked only that their parents be remembered for the lives they lived, not the way those lives ended. Hollywood responded with tributes and memories. Colleagues remembered Rob for his influence, his humor, and his generosity. Michelle was remembered as the quiet force who held everything together. The industry paused briefly, then moved forward, as it always does. What remains for the family is not resolution, but absence. The kind that does not announce itself loudly but settles into everyday moments where familiar voices no longer exist. There is no narrative that redeems this ending, no lesson that softens it. This story does not belong to headlines or speculation. It belongs to the quiet spaces left behind, to the rooms that no longer feel the same, and to the understanding that love, even when it is genuine and relentless, cannot always save what is already breaking. Some stories Hollywood tells have endings. Others simply stop.